Welcome everybody and good afternoon. My name is Camilla Fox and I'm the founder and executive director of Project Coyote. And we're excited to offer yet another webinar in our series with the Rewilding Institute. We've offered 4 to date and we're super excited about our guest today. The focus of these webinars is really about compassionate conservation, rewilding, and coexistence. And as always, these webinars are recorded. We'll be sending out a follow-up email tomorrow with a link. And Michelle will end after 45 minutes or so and have about 15 minutes for questions. And then any unanswered questions, Michelle has kindly offered to address, and we will have those in the follow-up. So I will also introduce John, who's my co-host. John is with the Rewilding Institute. And John, do you want to say a few words?
Sure. Thank you very much, Camilla. It's an honor to do these webinars with Project Coyote. Like Project Coyote, the Rewilding Institute is a small but mighty organization dedicated to restoring wildlife and wild places across the continent. And our fundamental mission is rewilding North America, very ambitious for a small group, and coexistence with carnivores and other wildlife is absolutely imperative to and central to that mission. So we're very pleased to be working with Project Coyote in many ways, but including these webinars.
And so I mentioned that we will have the last 15 minutes for Q&A. If you have any questions, please hold them, but go ahead and put them into the chat or question box. It's my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Michelle Lute. She's also known as Dr. Coexistence. Michelle is a conservation scientist and advocate with more than 15 years experience in biodiversity conservation on public and private lands across the globe. She holds a PhD in social ecology from Michigan State University and an MS in animal behavior and ecology from the University of Notre Dame and a BS in geography and environmental science. Michelle's work is largely focused in developing humane and effective solutions to address human-wildlife conflicts using an interdisciplinary approach. Michelle has authored more than 30 publications in ecology and social science disciplines to develop evidence-based approaches to promote peaceful coexistence. She has successfully ended the use of lethal tools in locales across the American West and documented strong public and expert support for coexistence. We are very pleased that Michelle has joined our team as Project Coyote's National Carnivore Conservation Manager. She's our latest staff member to join our team. Very pleased about her. So with no further ado, I will pass the virtual baton on to Michelle.
Thank you so much, Camilla, and thanks to John and everyone at the Rewilding Institute and to all of you today for joining and participating. I'm going to move to sharing my screen. All right, hopefully that's working now. So today you might notice that my title riffs on a rock and roll song made famous by Elvis Costello, written by Nick Lowe. I used it because I thought it was appropriate and funny. And I just recently revisited the lyrics and realized that the lyrics are actually really appropriate and could totally be talking about coexistence. I won't sing it for you, but a couple of lines are, as I walk through this wicked world, searching for light in the darkness of insanity, I ask myself, is all hope lost? Is there only pain and hatred and misery? So not a very light tone song, but very much one for navigating a difficult world and the questions around coexistence. The song ends with a question: where's the harmony, the sweet harmony? So on that very happy note, I wanted to first introduce myself a little bit more to let you know kind of where I'm coming from. And this is going to feed into why we're asking this question about what exactly is coexistence. So my background briefly, I'm a biologist, traditionally trained through my master's in ecology and animal behavior. There's some pictures of me with long-tailed macaque monkeys. I'm also a social scientist. So for my PhD, I took an interdisciplinary approach to understanding human-wildlife conflict, looking at wolves in Michigan as a case study to understand how to move from conflict to coexistence. I'm going to talk about that more today. I'm also an advocate. I've worked in academic positions, but I've also worked for great organizations like Project Coyote, which I'm so happy to have landed at. And basically, I'm an all-around weirdo who's just simply fascinated with the wild world and finding ways to share space with wildlife. I've worked in lots of different places. I've worked, researched, taught in Madagascar, Africa, South America, Southeast Asia, and of course, North America. Worked on lots of different species, from primates to wolves, from reptiles and birds. Lots of different species, lots of different people involved with conserving those species, and lots of different ecosystems. The common thread that I've found through a lot of this work is that the greatest need is finding solutions for conserving biodiversity very broadly, but also for protecting the vulnerable from the powerful. And when I talk about the vulnerable, that can be a carnivore species. We don't necessarily think of wolves as vulnerable as they move through the world, but they're vulnerable to human power structures that don't allow space for them. I also, when I mean the vulnerable, I mean the voices in wildlife decision-making that have not been represented traditionally. So that's another area where I really see that there is the greatest need. And I see all these challenges and actions fitting under the umbrella of coexistence. And I'll talk more about how those things all relate today. So today, I'm going to talk to you about research and advocacy around this question that we want to ask about what does it mean to coexist with wildlife. I'm trying, okay, advancing. My slides was not working. So I want to talk about this question. What does it mean to coexist? You might wonder, why is this question even important to ask? Don't we know what coexistence is? Aren't we, most of us in conservation, striving to do that? And I would say that based on my experience working in these different contexts with lots of different conservation professionals, varying advocates, and the public, I would argue that we don't necessarily yet agree or have the same goals in mind when we talk about coexistence. Or we might all have this vague general area that we're trying to strive for, but we really need to delineate very carefully what we mean when we talk about coexistence so that we can measure our progress and have really delineated goals towards that. So some people, when they talk about coexistence, they mean land sharing. So that means sharing space, spatial overlap between humans and wildlife. Other folks include land sparing, this concept that certain species might be best in protected areas, and that's still coexistence if they have a thriving population in a protected area, even if there's not spatial overlap with people. Coexistence could be a behavior. It could be an active behavior where we're actively trying to share spaces like our backyards with various wildlife. But it could also be passive. In the case of coyotes, they're in our backyards and lots of people don't even know it. So is that coexistence? There's lots of questions. So to illustrate this in a more specific example, I've got a picture of one of my favorite focal animals from my master's research. This is a long-tailed macaque monkey in Singapore, a highly dense urban city-state that has a central catchment reserve of secondary and primary rainforest, where these monkeys move in and out of the forest and the urban area. So they have a diet that consists of wild foods, particularly fruits, but they also find food from human sources. So they raid people's fruit trees and their garbage cans. So conflicts are rare and they are low level, but they do occur and they do make the news. So in this sort of situation, when I was working on the ground there, I wondered, is this the ideal of coexistence? Low level conflict, mostly everybody's getting along and finding the food they need and the space they need to live out their lives. But there's lots of questions. Would it be coexistence if the monkeys just stayed in the forest and there was little spatial overlap? What if the monkeys that I was following only left the forest at night when people didn't see them? So there was spatial overlap, but not temporal overlap. Is that coexistence? Is that the ideal for coexistence? These questions are really context dependent, and they really the answers depend on who you ask. So these variations on human-wildlife interactions may or may not constitute coexistence. And this has sort of launched a lot of my academic work and also my advocacy, is to understand what is coexistence? Are we coexisting with wildlife in various contexts? And so I want to explore some of those ideas and definitions with you today. And I would also argue that before we can even talk about exactly what coexistence is, we have to examine why we're asking this question. We're trying to fill a need occurring at the nexus of humans and wildlife to find solutions to challenges that have traditionally been framed as conflict. So actually, the first question we have to ask is what is conflict? Now, when we talk about human-wildlife conflict, I think a lot of people think of this kind of scenario where it's animals on the ground doing something that's inconvenient to humans and potentially leading to negative reactions from humans. I would argue that while this does happen, these instances are rare. And when we're talking about human-wildlife conflict, it's often between human groups, this sort of us versus them dynamic. So in modern times, a lot of the conflict that we're really trying to address is between people about what to do about wildlife. So this us versus them dynamic, I use a theory from social psychology called social identity theory that's been used in lots of different contexts across the globe in all kinds of cultures to understand why people affiliate in certain groups and then compete between those groups. So this diagram is just a representation of any group of humans that may seem diverse. Think of your neighbors, think of a group of Americans. There's lots of different sociodemographics that might be represented in any particular large group. But really what we can understand is that in any group, we've got identity groups that people affiliate with. So these are people that are like-minded, that talk, dress, eat the same foods, share the same values, and they affiliate together, even if they're intermixed with other groups. And these are identity groups. And people can have multiple identity groups, and they can be salient and strong or not relevant in particular contexts. And so this is one way to understand stakeholders in a way that's more nuanced than just saying there's a hunter stakeholder, there's a wildlife advocate stakeholder involved in this issue. So as I mentioned, you have groups that you affiliate with, you call them the in-group, they're like you. Because you know those individuals well, you see that there's diversity in your group, and you see these people in a more positive light. Now there are people outside of your group. They're considered others because you don't know them as well. We often have these biases that assume that other people are homogenous. They're all representatives of that particular group that I don't understand, and they don't share the same values as me. And whenever you have competition, whenever you have perceived differences in access to resources between these groups, you get competition. So in the past, when we were hunter-gatherers, our competition between groups was for territory or access to food. And now it's really about access to power brokers and whose values dominate a decision-making sphere. So social identity theory helps us understand why people conflict. And rather than lumping people in silos of prototypical stakeholder groups, identifying groups in this way helps us identify why they're conflicting, what they're fighting over, and how to address that conflict. And so that's another area I want to talk to you about today. So this is a diagram of the moral community. And when you ask questions about ethics and values, you have to use conservation ethics to find ways of finding common ground and agreement among these groups that might be conflicting. So one of the ways to do this is to ask people how they attribute intrinsic value. Intrinsic value is the value of something to exist beyond its use to anyone else. So if we say, yes, wolves have intrinsic value, that means they have a right to exist whether or not people benefit from them or use them in any way. So when we're trying to define the moral community, we're asking who do people attribute intrinsic value to? In the past, it was only certain groups of humans that really had rights in this way. But as societies have shifted to be more inclusive, we've included all humans, and now even non-human life, and even potentially ecosystems in including them in our moral community. And when I ask questions of lots of different stakeholders and various different wildlife issues, I found that most people agree, or at least give lip service to this idea that wildlife have intrinsic value. when we start asking questions about what other uses or values trump intrinsic value, that's where we start to really get to the core of disagreement. So some people might say, yes, this wolf has intrinsic value, but the value of my companion animal or livestock trumps that value. So if they're in danger, then taking the life of a wolf is justified. Other people disagree and draw those lines in different places. Generally, postmodern societies are shifting away from various reasons to killing wildlife as being justified. But we still see a certain contingent of people believing that inconvenience is even appropriate to take the life of an animal. So this is still a sticking point in a place where I argue is the core of disagreement about decisions to manage or conserve wildlife in various contexts. So this is where coexistence comes in. We may not have to navigate these differing value judgments if tools and methods that promote coexistence are made easily available, habitual, and broadly supported by society. We might have certain people who believe the intrinsic value of an animal is trumped quite easily, but if it's just habitual, if it's just a normal part of society to say, not leave your pet food outside, then perhaps that question of intrinsic value is moot, and we can move on and we can still promote coexistence. So now to our original and main question, what is coexistence? How do we define it and measure it in the world? And lots of folks have tried to start to delineate. I guess I shouldn't say lots of folks. It's a new and nascent discipline that people are trying to tackle in the last decade. So one definition that I like to include is from my very own Camilla Fox and other Project Coyote affiliates, Dave Parsons, Paul Paquette, and Michael Soleil. And they define coexistence as a mutually beneficial living arrangement that meets vital needs of humans and large carnivores. And I think this is a simple, really eloquent way to be thinking about coexistence, that the vital needs of everybody involved in the system, humans and large carnivores in this context, is important, and it has to be mutually beneficial to move forward and be self-sustaining. Some of my colleagues, academics, have taken their own approach to defining coexistence. And this is from Neil Carter and John Linnell. And they define coexistence as a dynamic but sustainable state in which humans and wildlife co-adapt to living in shared spaces. So there's a lot of elements here to unpack. It's dynamic, it's changing, but it's sustainable in the long run. It includes humans and wildlife co-adapting to each other. So that's a sort of two-way arrow in which humans adapt to wildlife and wildlife adapt to the presence and behaviors of humans. And this is all occurring in a shared landscape, suggesting spatial overlap. Like all good academics, their definition is kind of long-winded, and it continues, where human interactions with wildlife are governed by effective institutions that ensure long-term wildlife population persistence, social legitimacy, and tolerable levels of risk. So these authors are arguing that you have to have all of these elements to call it coexistence, to really be moving in the right direction, at least towards coexistence. Another one of the elements that I think is important to note is this notion of tolerable levels of risk. And I'm going to talk about some case studies and how they might address these various elements. But this is a really tough one in terms of defining what is a tolerable level of risk. This varies a lot based on who you ask. But if we're moving towards acceptance of some conflict, because likely we'll never reduce conflict to zero, if we're moving in that direction towards tolerance of some level of risk or conflict, then we can say that coexistence is probably likely. So there's lots more academic work that needs to be done to understand what coexistence means. For instance, some people might argue against the focus on population persistence in this definition. Some people might argue that ecosystem function and health and the ecological niche that a wildlife species contributes is really important part of coexistence. So lots more work to be done on understanding, if land sharing is really the focus of coexistence, if any lethal control is happening, does that constitute coexistence? Depending on who you ask, there are differing answers. So to start that inquiry, I asked a population of a sample of conservation professionals across the globe. We had about 20 countries represented. A lot of folks were answering from North America and Europe, but we had about a sample size of 700 professionals that answered questions in a survey a couple years ago. And we asked them, what does coexistence mean to you? What elements are necessary, and what are the solutions to conflict? And we see that there's some areas of agreement. In particular, when we asked, can humans and carnivores share space? And we saw that the vast majority, 86% of conservation professionals said, yes, humans and large carnivores can share space. And that is an important element of coexistence. We asked a number of other questions about coexistence. So let me break down what this graph means. So moving from 1 to 5, we're seeing increasing average agreement. And the size of the green bubbles indicates the level of consensus. So you can have any sort of average, but within those averages, well, averages don't tell you the wide range of responses you might be getting. So the smaller bubbles mean there's lots of consensus. We were getting all the same answer. And the bigger bubbles mean that there was a wide distribution, that bell curve was really wide. And there was less consensus and more disagreement about this answer. So what we see high consensus and high agreement about coexistence is a number of the elements included in the definition. So human adaptation to carnivores is really important for coexistence. Acceptance of some of that risk, a tolerable level of risk, also really high in agreement and consensus, as was enforcement and monitoring the rule of law and locals' acceptance of management authority. What we do not see high agreement or consensus was the permitting regulated hunting of carnivores or prohibiting any killing of carnivores. So we see that the lethal issue is still somewhat contentious, even among conservation professionals. But we see a couple of areas to really focus on. Human adaptation to carnivores is one that we have a lot of control over and can promote coexistence through those methods. We also asked about strategies for reducing conflict. Again, under this umbrella of what is coexistence and how do we move towards it, we see a plurality of responses. So lots of different potential strategies were seen as relatively effective. These include preventative measures like avoiding situations that put people at risk in the first place, adopting husbandry practices that prevent depredation, the restoration of wild prey populations, also really important to addressing conflict so that large carnivores have their prey base and are not looking elsewhere for food. Following those top elements or strategies are a number of other mostly decision-making and process-oriented sort of solutions. And again, I want to point out the lowest mean effectiveness was for legal hunting of large carnivores. So again, although there's some disagreement in the conservation professional community about this, it was generally was indicated as having less effectiveness compared to these other strategies. So that helps us answer a little bit about, at least when we're talking to conservation professionals, what they're thinking about in terms of coexistence. So one more graph to throw at you. This question was about what are the ultimate goals of conservation? And we see high agreement and high consensus that reducing negative impacts of humans on carnivores. And if you move down from reducing negative impacts of carnivores on people are both really important for conservation, as is this notion of intrinsic value and promoting it for carnivores. Again, another area of contention, but low mean agreement was promoting sustainable use, such as hunting of carnivores by humans. So this helps us understand, at least when we're talking to conservation professionals, be that wildlife managers and government institutions, or other researchers at universities, or people working on the ground in lots of different ways to promote coexistence. This is when they're talking, this might be what they mean. So to kind of root this now, this broad questions about coexisting with lots of wildlife into some specific case studies, I conducted a case study analysis to understand how we might or may not be coexisting with certain large carnivores in North America broadly. So I asked a number of questions about these key elements, including tolerable levels of risk. Are we reaching them with these various cases? About co-adaptation. Are humans adapting to this wildlife species? Are these wildlife co-adapting to humans? And then are we sharing space with these various species? So I asked each one of these questions in these 3 case studies of grizzly bears in the Northern Rockies, coyotes across North America, and then Mexican gray wolves in the Southwest. So land sharing with lobos or Mexican gray wolves, are we doing it? I think we have to look at a map to see how limited this is. So this is North America. We can zoom in on the territory and the historic range of Mexican gray wolves. So the historic range is roughly estimated in that blue oval, and wolves' current range, lobos' current range in the primary and secondary recovery zones is quite small. And so the experimental population area is that bigger green area. Wolves are not present in most of the green area, but they could potentially be recovered in those areas. So even if you're considering the green area, that's still a fraction, that's a very small percentage of their historic range. And where wolves currently exist is really not where too many people are, and they were placed there purposefully. So this is somewhat an agency-induced lack of spatial overlap, if you will, where wolves and humans are not sharing that much space. To a certain extent they are. There's obviously people in this area. This is the Gila National Wilderness in the Blue Range mountain recovery area in Arizona, and there are some people and there are a good amount of cows in this area, but in terms of spatial overlap, it's really quite limited between lobos and humans currently. So the next question is co-adaptation occurring in this context? I would say it's variable and it's sometimes negative. So although wolves are thought of as a symbol of wilderness, they're actually found in lots of different habitats. They're a generalist and they're pretty flexible in their diet. In the Great Lakes, they're eating a lot of beavers or places where beavers are available. We think of them taking down large elk or moose, but really that's a particular strategy for some packs in some places. And when that prey availability isn't there, they can be pretty adaptable. Sometimes they adapt by including cows or sheep in their diet. This is again rare, but it happens. So the adaptation that we see is not always adaptive in terms of it being the best thing for wolves. And so sometimes it's negative, this adaptation that wolves have to humans. Again, it's very little conflict, but when it happens, humans react sometimes very negatively. So the extent to which humans are adapting to wolves is also in question. We've got lots of tools, and I'll talk about some of those later, but we've got lots of tools to prevent depredation that would promote coexistence by most people's definition. And they're used in certain contexts, but not nearly as widely as they should be. So again, there's some variable co-adaptation occurring, but lots more work to do on that front to be promoting coexistence with lobos. To the last question, are we seeing tolerable levels of risk? This is a real challenging sticking point for, particularly for wolf management anywhere. Wolves are such a controversial species. We see a lot of support among many identity groups for lobos and gray wolves more broadly. But we see certain identity groups really not happy with the level of risk that they're incurring. And that's particularly among the agricultural community. So I would say tolerable levels of risk are occurring for most identity groups, for most constituents involved in wolf management, but are strongly not yet occurring in agricultural community. And this is a question of will we ever get to zero likelihood of conflict? Probably not. And how can we make some conflict acceptable? And that's by preventing it. And again, like I said, I'll talk about some of those tools a little bit later. Moving on to the second case study, coyotes in North America. They're everywhere. This is a really easy question, this first one to answer. Are we sharing land? Yes, indeed. Coyotes are just about everywhere we are across North America. So as we've decreased wolf populations, we've allowed coyotes to expand. They may have expanded into North America, across North America from their range in the Southwest several times, but this map kind of shows the most recent expansion and timing. So we now have coyotes in New York City, downtown LA, on O'Hare Airport, and everywhere in between. Rural, suburban, and urban areas. We're sharing space with coyotes, whether we know it or not. A number of years ago, I interviewed Camilla about coexistence with coyotes, and I loved her phrasing. I think she said, we're silently coexisting in most contexts because coyotes are everywhere, and we don't necessarily realize they're in our backyards. So again, this comes up to the question of, active versus passive coexistence. But in terms of land sharing, in terms of spatial overlap, it's definitely happening, for sure. Is co-adaptation happening? Well, I would say it is, for sure, but it's a little bit more coming from coyotes than it is from humans. Coyotes are great. They're very adaptable. They can be solitary and focus on eating rodents that also love to live near humans. And they can be in packs that are taking down larger prey. So again, very highly plastic, adaptable species that has learned to live with humans and been able to benefit from living near humans by, as I mentioned, focusing on rodent prey. But humans adapting to coyotes, again, we've got lots of places where their conflict just isn't an issue. And so people are passively adapting to coyotes. Lots of instances where people are learning that, oh, coyotes are my backyard and I need to adjust my behavior. I need to keep my small pets on a leash. I need to not have pet food in my backyard. So people are definitely in lots of contexts adapting, but there are always certain caveats and, so to speak, bad apples that are breeding conflict in certain areas because they're not adapting to the presence of coyotes by making simple changes. So yes, it's happening a lot, co-adaptation, but still room for improvement there. As for our third question, tolerable levels of risk. Again, most people that coyotes don't pose a risk and they're fine sharing space. So I would say in a lot of realms, this is happening, but there's always that caveat. So it's mostly yes, but there are certain individuals and certain organizations, even including the US Department of Agriculture's program called Wildlife Services, that are not finding any sort of tolerable level of risk, and instead are lethally controlling coyotes and probably breeding more conflict by doing that. So as I mentioned, Wildlife Services, they will prophylactically kill coyotes during calving or lambing seasons when you have vulnerable young livestock on the ground. They will just basically aerially gun, poison, trap coyotes in lots of places just to momentarily try to push their population numbers down to protect livestock. There are better ways to prevent or to protect vulnerable livestock, such as sheltered calving areas, synchronized breeding, where you can bring all of the mothers in to give birth in a place that's protected by humans and sheltered. And that also protects animals from dying of disease when they're not being monitored. So there's lots of other tools that people could use, and yet they don't. So this is a big caveat. It's a big black eye on wildlife services and federal agencies that are not coexisting with wildlife. Moving on to our third case study, grizzly bears in the Northern Rockies. Are we sharing land with these species? I would say it's limited. If you see in the picture from 1880, that green extent is the extent of grizzly bears in the American West. They were basically found everywhere except for deserts west of the Mississippi. But as of 2010, you can see the green in that map being the current extent of grizzly bears. This is like Mexican gray wolves, a situation in which bears are mostly in wild lands where people are not. The important exception is that there's lots of people visiting Yellowstone National Park, where that lower, the more southern green blob population extent is. And there's a growing corridor along Livingston and Bozeman where there's lots of people moving to that area. Amenity migrants is what they call them, moving to a beautiful area with lots of wild places, but those wild places are threatened if that growing urban population is not managed. So they're in close proximity to grizzly bears. So although spatial overlap between humans and grizzly bears is currently limited, it may not always be that way, as hopefully grizzly bears recover and as potentially people expand in that area. Coadaptation, is it occurring? I would say, and so this is a really interesting case where it varies by the age and sex class of individual bears. And I can't get into the details right now, but basically adult females and their dependent young, as well as subadult males, may be moving and using landscapes closer to humans, in part to avoid adult male grizzlies, who are usually the least tolerated of individuals and are not affiliating close to human areas. We also have an issue of ecological traps, where there are places that bears really like. It's great habitat. There's tons of huckleberries and various food to fatten up before the winter. But these are also places that people like to be. They like to recreate. So the issue of ecological traps, where it's really good habitat for bears for a while, but leads to conflicts that then get bears killed by humans, is a really interesting case of trying to figure out how coadaptation could be occurring in ways that promote coexistence better. Tolerable levels of risk, I would say, are quite achievable. For various reasons, again, I can't get into right now. Bears are more accepted than very controversial wolves. I think the short answer is the Little Red Riding kind of mythologies that really vilify wolves over any other species. Debate that as well in the questions about what's the most controversial species. But for the most part, people seem to be more open-minded about coexisting with bears, and the risk is low enough that it doesn't seem to be aggravated by these other mythological or cultural ideas about the species. So quite achievable, but of course, still more work to be done. I always like to end talking about these various case studies with a great quote from one of the key informants that I do during this, this case study analysis. And this key informant said, "It doesn't take many bad apples to spoil the batch. Some intolerant folks breed conflicts, given how widely bears range and how indelible food experiences are." So he's talking particularly about bears and how important they stick to an area that has good food, and how one person, if your neighbor isn't doing what he should do to keep food out of his yard and attract bears, he could be breeding conflict that then affects a greater area, because these large carnivores travel vast distances and have large territories. So they really require a lot of space. If you've got one person breeding conflict, that's affecting a lot of neighbors, and that's affecting potentially a lot of bears. And I think this applies not just to bears, but lots of large carnivores, lots of wildlife. It's really hard, even if we have a lot of folks open and willing to coexist with wildlife. We get a couple people that really don't want to change behavior. It's really difficult to move the needle for coexistence. And so that's one of the areas of future work to promote coexistence. So how can we move from conflict to coexistence in this hot, hungry world that we call the Anthropocene, where human-dominated landscapes are the norm? How do we use tools on the ground and make decisions to promote coexistence? I love thinking about on the ground coexistence tools in terms of the old and the new. And we have lots of basically ancient tools with modern updates that are promoting coexistence in really powerful ways. So you see this guy on a horse in this picture. This is basically a modern shepherd. It's a range rider. Sometimes they ride ATVs, sometimes they're on horseback, but they can cover a lot of ground. And just the presence of humans in near livestock is often all you need to protect livestock from any potential conflict. So this is a really powerful tool. We've been doing it for hundreds of years, for a really long time, and it's still powerful today. And of course, we have modern tools like GPS and cell phones to be able to track livestock, to track where you're at on the landscape and cover a lot of ground, and sometimes even know where large carnivores are. Fences and fladry are another useful tool. Here's another picture of range riders in a really big landscape. And fladry is this red flagging that you see in this picture. This is another ancient tool with a sorted past. It was used in Scandinavia actually to hunt wolves. So they strung fladry along a funnel basically and funneled wolves into this area, into a smaller area to then kill them. Now we're using it for a much better purpose, to keep wolves out of an area where there are livestock. They use it for coyotes and other canids, but it works best for wolves. For some reason, they mistrust these red flags and they don't want to walk under them. And so you can easily, very quickly throw this up and protect livestock in an area, especially during a calving or a lambing season when you've really got vulnerable individuals that you need to protect. Of course, canids are very smart. They're eventually going to figure out that this flagging is nothing to worry about. So this is a context-dependent sort of tool that's useful to use in the short term and not necessarily the long term. There's lots of other different kinds of fencing options, solar-powered fences that are lightweight, can move around for rotational grazing practices. Electrified fences are better for keeping out bears. So there's lots of different tools. Guard dogs are another one, very context dependent. Certain breeds bark a lot, so you don't want them near other human residences. Certain breeds are better for backcountry, really rugged terrain. So there's lots of different tools, a whole suite of tools. There's a whole suite of tools. There's fox lights, there's rag boxes, radio activated guard boxes, all kinds of tools that can be used, but are really context dependent. Another tool that I think is really important and perhaps applicable to more of us that aren't farmers or ranchers is the tool of democracy, which is one that has not we haven't had very democratic decision-making about wildlife up until this point. So this is a picture of Richard Nixon signing the Endangered Species Act, an historic day. But you'll see that not everybody's demographics are represented in this picture. It's all older white men deciding this. And I would argue that to this day, there's a lot of decisions about wildlife that are still being made by these sorts of folks. And we really need to truly promote coexistence. We have to return to democracy and other forms of inclusive decision-making. We have to lobby for or against various legislation. One important one that's coming up is a ban on traps on public lands in New Mexico. There's lots of other options, lots of other legislation that's hopefully coming now that we have a better federal administration. So things to look forward to on the state and federal level are hopefully coming up for the next 4 years and beyond. There's also, as we've seen, ballot initiatives are a powerful tool in lots of states, and those could be used to promote coexistence, as we've seen, to take away certain lethal tools, but they can also have a cultural backlash, as we've seen with constitutional amendments to, quote unquote, protect the right to hunt and fish. So we have to be careful about these tools and really use them wisely, but they can be really powerful. Another example is obviously the referendum to introduce wolves into Colorado. So these are all potential democratic tools to use to promote coexistence. And another one that I like to talk about is promoting and driving public input. And this could be on state regulations, administrative rulemaking, federal legislation of all sorts. And the one really great creative idea that I love to include is from this comic artist who goes by the Oatmeal. And so typically he is writing funny comics about flying kittens. He had a really popular board game that came from one of his comics that you may be familiar with his style because of that. But several years ago, he found out about a federal decision regarding promoting coexistence of grizzly bears in the North Cascades. And he put together this comic and drove over 50,000 comments. So typically federal public input, you are lucky if you get several thousand comments on any particular decision. And he, within a matter of days, got 50,000 comments or more on a decision to promote conservation of grizzly bears in the Northern Cascades. So I just like to include this whenever I'm talking to fellow wildlife advocates, is let's think outside the box. Let's be creative about promoting democracy and speaking beyond our choir and getting lots of people involved. I think this shows that people really do care about large carnivores and other wildlife, and they really do care about coexistence, and we just have to tap them. So I think I'm reaching my time. I'll just end with that note. We need creative thinking. We need diversity in inclusive decision-making about wildlife. So we need everybody promoting coexistence in their backyard, in their town halls, and in their voting booths. And there's lots of tools to collaborate with each other and collaborate with other environmental justice efforts. It won't be easy, but it's really important, and there's lots of good work to do. So these are the frontiers of future coexistence initiatives, and I welcome everybody's questions and comments. And this is just a number of the papers that I referenced today. I kind of include these as a shout out to my co-authors. Happy to share any of these papers with people who are interested in digging in more detail about coexistence. So thanks, everybody.
Beautiful, Michelle, thank you. All right, so we have a number of questions that have come in. I will start with Julie Sutton's question. She asks, have you found that fencing is a controversial tool, particularly on rangeland?
Yes, it seems that most of the tools we want to promote for coexistence can be controversial among certain demographics, certain individuals, certain folks. I think it speaks to the difficulty in what we call in the academic sphere, the diffusion of innovations. Whenever you're seeking behavior change, whenever you're trying to get somebody to do something new or get yourself even to do something new, it's really, really difficult to change the status quo and implement new tools. And fencing is one of them. So fencing obviously has its own ecological drawbacks. Unless it's wildlife friendly fencing that allows for migration of pronghorn or mule deer or whatever the particular species in the area is, it can be dangerous and lead to mortality of wildlife. So you have to really design it well, and it has to be wildlife friendly. And then there's maintenance. So there's a lot of barriers to implementing fencing, but when you do have livestock on the landscape in certain places, fencing can be the best way to separate large carnivores from livestock on that small scale that you need. But if you're doing rotational fencing or rotational grazing, excuse me, fencing can be difficult to plan. So again, that's where you need lightweight fencing or you need other tools. So yeah, it can be controversial like a lot of them, but it's appropriate in certain contexts.
Great. John, do you want to pose a question?
Sure. One from Maureen Gustafson. When so many conflict reduction tools are available, and some of them are relatively simple to implement, why are so many ranchers and other property owners resistant to using them?
I think I sort of addressed that, so hopefully I don't sound like a broken record, but I think it's just a matter of behavior change. And so that, it's hard to learn new tools and new skills at any stage, and people are reluctant to do that. And it also requires an investment of resources. It takes time and money to put up fences and to maintain them, or to learn new tools, to invest in fox lights that will deter carnivores in certain contexts. So various technologies may not be trusted also by certain ranchers. They're used to doing things a certain way, and it's worked in the past for them. At least by their measures, it's working. It's not necessarily allowing carnivores in these landscapes. So there's room for improvement, of course. But I think this is where, again, social identity theory comes in that you trust individuals in your own group more. So when they're the people communicating, hey, I used this tool and it actually really works, instead of a wildlife advocate coming in who lives in the city that's not in your county and says, you should use this tool. People are right to say, like, do you really know what you're talking about? I get that a lot. I try and promote these things. And people ask me, do you really know what you're talking about? But when I say, actually, I'm the daughter of a third generation farmer and I've talked to lots of other ranchers in this area and they find it useful, then you can get more buy-in, and you can engage in these real, honest, candid conversations where people are not thinking of you as a representative of your group. So people aren't looking at me as just a wildlife advocate coming in from big city Santa Fe and telling them what to do in the Gila. When I can affiliate and talk to them in the ways that we have some common ground or shared values, then I'm a more trusted source of information. So I think one of the challenges is to find innovative, open-minded ranchers that are willing to be the right spokespeople for these new tools, that are willing to say, you know what, I'm gonna stick my neck out, I'm gonna put my money where my mouth is, and I'm gonna invest in this new tool. And it's going to take some money, and it's going to take a lot of my time to learn how to implement it or maintain it. When we can find those people and promote their good stories, then we're going to see a lot more change on the ground, a lot more people willing to try out these new tools. But until then, it's slow going to reach these communities, just because of the biases that all humans have to affiliate with people that they know and that they trust.
Right. Couple of people asked, what about coexistence with the cougar or mountain lion?
That's a great one. So I had considered including that one as one of the case studies in my analysis, but there's so much to unpack with each of these species that it ended up just getting too long. So I can't speak to it as in depth as the other species that I've worked with more. But I would say, there's some elements from each of the cases that would apply to cougars. So cougars have never been protected on the endangered species list. That means that their populations are maybe doing well in certain places. We don't often monitor populations, so it's really hard to say exactly, but we've got persistent populations of cougars in places, and they're less controversial. That's really the key, seems to be when you get a species is put on the Endangered Species Act, they tend to be more controversial among certain identity groups, particularly because they represent the federal government telling people what to do on their private or public lands that they have access to. So it becomes more controversial. So I think in some ways, because cougars haven't been on the ESA, they're less controversial, and there's more achievable goals around finding tolerable levels of risk for promoting adaptation to carnivores. They depredate sometimes on livestock, but they're really not, like any wild carnivore, we really don't see high numbers of cougars depredating on livestock. So I think generally, to the extent that I can speak to the species, I would say that coexistence is quite achievable. And there's lots of great individuals and organizations working on mountain lion conservation, particularly Mountain Lion Foundation. Project Coyote also works on mountain lion conservation. So there's definitely room for improvement, but I find that to be, and maybe I'm biased because I just think of how controversial wolves are, but I find that to be really promising in promoting coexistence in the future.
I'll mention too that we're hoping in a future webinar to have a cougar expert on, Dr. Rick Hopkins, who serves on our science advisory board. He is not only works with us, but also the Cougar Fund. So he or another mountain lion expert will be joining us in a future webinar. Over to you, John.
Sure. Deborah asks about influencing the Interior Department of the upcoming President Biden. I'll just say quickly that if you go to rewilding.org, you'll see the Healing Nature's Wounds campaign that Rewilding and Project Coyote are helping spearhead. So that will answer some of your questions on that. And then a challenging question from Kelly, wondering if coexistence is really possible under our current structure of state wildlife agencies and their perceived or real commitment to hunters and trappers and so-called sustainable use of carnivores?
That's a great question. And it is a challenging one. I think it speaks to the notion that I referenced earlier about the bad apples that are driving conflict, that aren't promoting coexistence and getting in the way of the rest of us and our coexistence goals. And I would say that state agencies are, by and large, getting in the way of promoting coexistence for sure, with their focus on only consumptive use of wildlife. I will also say that there are lots of good folks that are not necessarily at the leadership level of state agencies, but that do want to promote coexistence. So this is another realm where democratic, inclusive decision-making processes that create good policies that then allow those well-meaning state agency staff to put more money or time into conserving non-game species, for instance. If we had those policies in place, we could really promote coexistence really strongly. So state agency reform is super important. It's something that Project Coyote has been working on and is continuing to work more on, because we see that as really foundational. If we can change that, we can change the game and promote conservation and coexistence across North America. So it'll be really important. But I will say that also having strong policies that promote non-game conservation, that diversify funding from state agencies, will allow those well-meaning people that aren't at leadership positions, and this is state or federal, there's lots of well-meaning biologists that are trying to do good work. So if we protect the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, if we protect the Endangered Species Act, we allow those state agencies to implement good work. So there's definitely some role for collaboration and a lot of room for reform to improve how states manage wildlife. So that's a great question, and that's the root, that's the crux, really. I think in the next decade is working on changing that.
Excellent. Don Littmanson asks, would you agree that part of the struggle for coexistence is the pride many ranchers take in using old school ways of dealing with predators, i.e. just kill them?
Yeah, I would say Don is hitting the nail on the head there. Coming from an agricultural background, coming from, generations of farmers, I can kind of understand sort of that pride that we've been stewarding this land for a long time. And past generations of my own family were draining wetlands and throwing down clay tiles to grow corn and soybeans. And that's a part of the legacy that I'm not very proud of, but I am proud of the ways in which my family have been stewards of the land in a good way. So it's a challenge to say that your grandfather did something that we don't value anymore. In the case of, killing wolves, a lot of people say, past generations did that for a reason. Are you saying that my grandfather was wrong? And that's a really hard conversation to have. And that's one that I've really had to grapple with. And I don't know how to approach it. But there is this pride that we have to understand, because that's a human emotion. But we have to be willing to move on. So I have to be willing to move on from my family's legacy and do so in a way that feels good and promote the good things and say, hey, some of it wasn't great. We know better now. And I'm working to reverse those things that weren't so good. And I think if we can have those honest conversations, we can move past that. But that it's a really tough one. And it's hard to have those conversations. And you have to have interpersonal relations where these ranchers and you can talk to them in a way that feels safe to move past that. And that's the role of overcoming social identity conflict and just relating to people as humans, getting past your stakeholder groups or whatever you're representing, and say, what, we're going to meet as humans and we're going to have a conversation. And we're going to be open-minded to change, all of us. So I'm not just asking you to do it, I'm going to do it too. And I think that's a start. It's still really hard.
A couple points followed by a question. Kim points out wildlife crossings, underpasses, and overpasses are another way to promote coexistence with wildlife. And they've been proven helpful with coyotes, wolves, bears, deer, and many other critters. Strong need for those across North America. I'd quickly mention on the side, there's a National Wildlife Conservation Corridors bill in Congress that I urge all of you to look into and support. Wildlands Network has a lot of information on that. And then another comment and a question from Jackie. Beef is probably the most resource expensive protein humans eat, and yet its use is spreading worldwide, and it really is not even very healthy. Do you think there is any hope of humans adapting their diet?
Yes, actually, I think there's a lot of hope. We're seeing in the news Beyond Meat and Impossible Burgers gaining some attention. Just in the last week or two, I saw in the news that Singapore has approved selling lab-grown meat at various restaurants in Singapore now. So we're on the cusp of a huge change to the industry. I've read stats like by 2040, it will be, even with subsidies continuing as they have to lessen the costs that ranchers have growing beef. Even with those subsidies, it still will not make sense economically to raise meat on the hoof outside, and that these lab-grown meats, once they overcome the initial sort of like, ick, gross, what is that? Once they overcome that fear factor, people will by and large adopt a new method for eating meat. So in the case of lab-grown meats, it's a small change. It's not even necessarily giving up meat. It's just changing the source of that meat that may help innovate this industry. And then, of course, vegetarian, flexitarian, vegan diets are also growing. It's still a small percentage. It needs to be more to address climate change, to address animal welfare, to address wildlife conservation. And that seems to, as I've said, innovation of various different ideas and diffusion of those new behavior changes, really hard and slow, but it's happening for sure. So there's definitely different models for promoting a different way of feeding ourselves in a healthy way. And there's lots of challenges still to overcoming various energy inputs and making food efficient and safe and healthy and nutritious. But lots of people working on it, really exciting frontier. I'm super hopeful that that's gonna help, because I think taking away the conflict with large carnivores and cows, the beef industry basically will address so much of our challenges to compassionate coexistence.
Excellent. I know we're bumping up against the hour. Carly Padilla posed a question asking about Project Coyote and if we provide presentations around coexisting with coyotes, presentations like this. Yes, we do. And I do see that you provided your email address, so we will respond to you, and happy to help in any way that we can. So I just want to thank Michelle and thank John and Jack and Kaylee, who are behind the scenes helping to make all this happen. Thank you all for joining, and we probably won't reconvene until the new year, but I wish you all a safe and peaceful and healthy holiday. So best to you all. Thanks for joining. We're loving seeing our numbers rise, and we will be sending a follow-up the link that you can share and help us get it out far and wide, because that's part of what we're really trying to do, is get these messages out to the world. So any help with that, we would greatly appreciate. So thank you all.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks, Michelle. You did great.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Bye.